Now, one thing we have to keep in mind, and this is something I think that's problematic and it's kind of played down in Korean history, is that Korea was part of the Japanese Empire during this time period, right? And Koreans tend to look back at this and they want to focus on the really terrible things that happened to them, and that makes sense. And we will talk about those terrible things. But we also need to kind of broaden this out to consider more fully what's going on, and I'll give you some examples of what I mean. But one thing we have to know, first of all, is that Korea's place in the empire is changing during this expanding war with China. And then, of course, it will change even further once you have war with the United States and Great Britain and so forth. So one of the major changes is that increasingly as Japanese labor costs go up, whereas Koreans are becoming more educated and are learning Japanese, there's going to be a shift of Japanese industry increasingly to Korea. So Korea will go from a place in the Japanese empire that principally exists for the production of rice to having an increasingly important manufacturing centers, right? So there's going to be increasing industrialization in Korea and increasing urbanization. And we'll talk more about this later, but what that means is that will lead to the development eventually of Korean communism, right? With a stronger base, right? Communism tends to be more attractive to urban workers. That's what it was initially designed for. And once you start having urban workers in Korea, you're going to start having communists. But we'll talk about that more later. For now, I just wanted to note, to give you a couple statistics, right? The number of Korean factory workers will almost quadruple in a decade, right? From 1933 to 1943, they're going to increase from 99,000 to 390,000. So that's a huge, huge, more than almost a 4 times increase. The urban population in that approximate time period will almost double. So more and more Koreans are going to become workers, and Korea is going to be becoming increasingly industrialized. Now, one thing I should note is that there's still a kind of discrimination here, right? You'll see the Japanese workers earn 2 yen a day, whereas Taiwanese earned 1 yen, and Koreans earn 60.66 yen. So they don't even get a full yen. So there's this kind of ethnic discrimination. And this is always, again, the problem that the Japanese face in terms of their claim to be trying to liberate Asians, right? And is that they run their empire in an unequal way. So why would China want to be a part of this, right? This industrialization or urbanization increases with war mobilization. And what's key, though, is it doesn't just stay in Korea. Lots of Koreans will go to Japan to work in factories there and all throughout the empires into such places as Manchuria. And so there'll, again, be this kind of expansion we've been talking about where Japanese subjects, and this would include Koreans, right? They're subjects of the Japanese Empire, though they're second-class subjects, are able to move throughout the empire. Sometimes voluntarily in order to get better jobs, to find new opportunities. Sometimes they're drafted and are forced to be a part of this as the war effort. So there is a conscription of Korean laborers for the war effort. One particularly uncomfortable thing we have to note is that this kind of mobilization for labor also included what we might call sexual labor. This is a very uncomfortable topic to talk about, and I'm not even sure of the right vocabulary to use, but this is what is called today the comfort women issue. Basically, the Japanese military wanted to make sure that its soldiers had access to sex, and a way to make sure that they had access to sex was to have women who were available to have sex with. And it's difficult to find women who want to go to the near the front lines to serve as to serve as prostitutes. So what the Japanese government did was it just forced women to be prostitutes, or I shouldn't even say forced women to be prostitutes. This is what I mean. This is very difficult to talk about because it's not clear the vocabulary. But basically, the Japanese military forced women to have sex with men near the front lines. And these women were not paid, so it's not even correct to say that they were forced to be prostitutes because a prostitute is paid. Sometimes the phrase used is sexual slavery. I'm a little uncomfortable with that term. it's just really bad. I mean, I don't know how to describe this, but like I said, just to give you the facts, what happened was women were often told that they would be given a job as a nurse or something like that. And this often happened to Korean women, but this happened to Chinese, Filipino, and even some Dutch women. But they would either be told that they were going to be having a job as like a nurse or something like that. They would join up, then they would be taken to wherever it was that the Japanese army was, and they'd say, okay, now your job is to have sex with these guys. And this could be 20 to 30 or more men in one day. So this was a very painful and difficult and humiliating experience. And this is like I said, a major issue to this day. Sometimes women were even tricked. They were just rounded up and forced to do this. This particularly happened in the Philippines, where the Japanese army would just grab Filipino women and say, okay, you guys are going to have sex with Japanese soldiers now, whether you like it or not. So this seems to me like serial rape or something like that. I don't know. It's just really, really terrible. And like I said, it's even hard to kind of wrap our heads around it and talk about it. But this went on, and like I said, it was really terrible. And in a sense, because it's so terrible, it still continues on as an issue. This is a statue dedicated to comfort women in Korea. And it may seem at first as kind of an odd place to put a statue because it's just on a street corner. The reason it's there is because this is right across the street from the Japanese embassy. So they often have protests here against Japan, and you can see a lot. Like I said, you can see lots of protests there. And this is just meant to be a constant reminder to the Japanese embassy of what Japan's had done in its past, right? And they chose this kind of young woman in a dignified position in order to kind of restore the dignity of these poor women who really suffered, what can I say, kind of unspeakable evil. So the Japanese government, colonial government, wanted to mobilize the Koreans for military service. And again, there's these kind of contradictions. They requested Korean volunteers to be in the military. We already talked about Park Chung-hee. Remember, he volunteered to be in the Manchurian military before the invasion of China. And so there was a request for Korean volunteers. Some did sincerely volunteer, but most were pressured to volunteer. And so what they would do is they would volunteer, but they would purposely like mess up their forms that they filled out, or they would act sick or something like that when they were interviewed or inspected so that they hopefully wouldn't be recruited. Right. So what's tricky was that very large numbers of Koreans would volunteer, and I'm making the quote marks, but most were pressured to do so. Right. Only a few were very sincere, and the military could see that. And so very few were actually recruited. So more than 800,000 would actually apply, but only 17,000 would be enlisted because the government just could see that a lot of these guys were not sincere and didn't really want to join. And sometimes what you had was Koreans who were independence activists wanted to join because they would get then guns, and then they would run away with their guns and go join the resistance. They could get military training and from the Japanese and then take their weapons and go fight the Japanese. In general, this is kind of the problem, is the Japanese never really trusted the Koreans. And so there was this weird kind of situation where they wanted Koreans to volunteer to make it seem like Koreans cared about the empire, but they didn't trust them to actually let them enlist in large numbers. And a lot of Koreans, they probably wouldn't have gotten large numbers because Koreans didn't want to enlist. However, what's really bizarre, and I think this is kind of fascinating, is that there were Koreans who would be given, who were accepted, who were trusted, and would actually be allowed to lead Japanese troops. Right. And I want to mention, during this war, for example, the United States, we had a segregated army. And there was no way that an African-American man would have ever been allowed in this time period to command white troops. But to in a sense, to the Japanese Empire's credit at least, they were willing to allow trusted Koreans to lead Japanese troops into battle. It did sometimes happen. Now, over 100,000 Koreans would be conscripted, would be forced in a sense to serve, and this is men, to serve the Japanese military, but they were principally not as frontline soldiers. For example, often they were prison guards. But one thing I want to stress from the American perspective, if we want to understand American actions in Korea, Koreans maybe didn't like this, but from the American perspective, Americans witnessed and experienced Koreans fighting for Japan. And one of the principal ones was as prison guards when Americans were taken prisoner. But like I said, you've got this weird conundrum where the Japanese want to mobilize Koreans for the war effort. They don't really trust them that much, so very few are actually mobilized. Those that are, except for a few exceptions, are usually in the back. They're like prison guards or laborers and working in factories and things like that. And at the same time, where you had this situation where the Japanese don't really trust the Koreans, they really ramp up the assimilation policy to make Koreans like Japanese, to make them into civilized Asians. And this is where you get this increased pressure on Koreans to use Japanese, not simply when they speak in public, but even at home in private. And this is when Koreans are forced to change their names, right? There's not like a law that says you have to change your name, but there's immense pressure, especially on Koreans who are upper class and elites, to change their names, to give up their Korean names and take Japanese names. And this was very, very painful and difficult for Koreans to do. As you probably have seen so far, Japanese and Korean names are completely different. And Korea was a Confucian society where you literally worshipped your ancestors. So in a sense, changing your name from the name used by your ancestors cut you off from that past. And that's exactly what the Japanese wanted. Right? They wanted to cut Koreans off from their past to assimilate them. Koreans were also expected to bow towards the palace, to worship, in a sense, the emperor as a god. In the morning, you were expected to bow towards the palace. And these things could win outward conformity. I mean, Koreans will change their names, they'll bow towards the palace. But a lot of them, when they bow towards the palace, they'll curse the emperor under their breath. But if you were to do more than that, you could be thrown in jail, where you would likely be beaten, and where you could die, right? You could be thrown in jail where you likely could be beaten and even die. And this happened even to people who did passive resistance. So for example, if the Japanese said, we're collecting brass for the war effort, we need brass to make bullets, so hand over your brass. If you didn't give up all your brass and they found out that you were keeping lots of brass in your house, and Koreans had brass because you used brass utensils in ancestor worship, that would be enough to get you in jail, where you can be beaten and die. And it's important to note that this shapes Korean memory today. This is what Koreans really think back to, is this period after the invasion of China, when the Japanese did some really, really terrible things to Koreans. That's what really shapes the memory even today. And I just want to highlight this image. This shows this idea that we need to cooperate together in order to kind of construct this new world. And they've got these two boys in a three-legged race. The one on the right, it says that's the Chinese character for inside, but it means Japan. And the one on the left has the character for Korea that the Japanese used. And on one side, it's this idea we're working together, but notice the bigger boy is the Japanese boy, the one on the right. He's the dominant one. So you've still got this idea, we need to work together, but you're following our lead. So how did Koreans respond to all this? Right? We have to remember, Japan is just very powerful in the Korean peninsula. And it's very difficult to resist it. And this is one thing I have kind of a pet peeve, is that sometimes Koreans will look back at the Koreans in the 30s and 40s and be really hard on them. And I think there's some you can be hard on because they totally were just terrible to other Koreans just to advance their own position. But I think that there's, that being said, I think there is a tendency not to realize just how difficult it was if you were Korean to resist the Japanese during this time. The Japanese had lots of soldiers, lots of police, to keep an eye on you. And any kind of overt resistance is suicidal. Like if you were going to try to do anything in Korea that directly targeted the government, you were going to die in a terrible, painful way. So most Koreans just grudgingly obeyed the government, right? They just put up with, right? They just put up with it. When they could, if they were brave, they would passively resist. Like I said, I gave you the example that the government says, we want brass. You hide your brass. And you may say, well, again, what's the big deal? Well, hiding your brass could get you in a lot of trouble. It could get you thrown in jail. It could even get you dead. So that was about the best you could do. If you were brave, you passively resisted when you could. Now, some Koreans would actively collaborate, right? Some Koreans would actively collaborate with the government. And this, again, if you're Korean now, this is very hard to understand. And for some, I think we can criticize it because they worked with the Japanese because the Japanese were powerful. And they wanted to keep their positions of power in society, so they worked with the Japanese. And that's very selfish in a sense. But others thought that if Japan won, it would help Korea. right? If we're on the winning team, if we're loyal to Japan, that will benefit us, right? If Japan wins the war, wouldn't that be good for Korea? And it's easier to believe that Japan will win the war in the early 1940s, especially because we have to remember that this is not a country where there's freedom of the press. They don't realize until later that they're actually losing the war. But in 1941, 1942, it's easy to believe that Japan is going to win this thing. So here's the thing. If you're Korean, you may say, let's work with the Japanese and help the Japanese win because that will benefit Korea. Right? The Japanese will take Koreans seriously. They will trust us. They will give us a better position in the empire. Things will be better. And so some Koreans do sincerely believe this and fight hard for the Japanese empire. And the image I have there for you, that is a language textbook, Japanese language textbook that says national language. National meant Japanese. That was issued to Korean students. And it has a pilot on the front. And there's this idea, hey, I'm going to go join the Japanese Imperial Air Force, right? There's not actually an Air Force, but they have Navy and Army had their own air forces. But I'm going to go become a pilot. And there were actually Koreans who became kamikaze pilots, right? These guys who would fly their planes into American ships. And these guys clearly believed that what the Japanese Empire was doing and that helping the empire to win would be good for the Korean nation, right? So we have to understand, in a sense, there are Koreans who will work with the Japanese government because they think that will help Korea. If the empire wins, that's good for Koreans. There's others who are much more selfish who just do this to keep their positions of power or to prosper, right? And this is kind of tricky when you go back to this time period of seeing, who is who. But of course, there were also Koreans who fought very hard as much as they could against the Japanese Empire. We've mentioned Kim Il-sung earlier, right? The guerrilla leader. I'm not going to talk about him right now. We'll talk more about him later. But I want to mention Syngman Rhee. Syngman Rhee, remember, he's that Korean nationalist who was in the United States, who speaks English really well, and he's always bothering, in a sense, American politicians. I mean, they get sick of him because he's always bothering them, asking them to work for Korean independence. And the 20s and into the 30s, they just kind of ignore this guy. But as tensions develop with Japan, Americans are more willing to listen to Syngman Rhee, who is arguing that Japan is bad, that it's a threat to the free world, and that helping Korea to become independent would be a good idea. And so he will continue those diplomatic activities. And it's amazing timing, in a sense. In 1941, he publishes a book called Japan Inside Out, where he talks about how Japan's a threat, and then the Japanese attack the Americans at Pearl Harbor, right? So, I mean, it wasn't too hard to predict that this might happen, but it is something that made him seem more impressive. And the Americans are going to know this guy, and he's going to be the one, in a sense, who later on the United States will turn to help lead Korea after World War II. I want to point out what's interesting also about Syngman Rhee. He married an Austrian woman. That's his wife right there on the right. Syngman Rhee was smart. He tended to live a lot of his life in Hawaii, which is a great place to live. And that's why they have on those leis there. And that picture is actually taken in Hawaii. But you also, like I said, I want to stress, you did have Koreans who would resist the Japanese Empire actively, like Syngman Rhee. But do note, he lives outside of Korea, and that's what allows him to do that. Now, looking from the Allied perspective, naturally we tend to focus, being a course taught in the United States by an American professor to mostly American students, we tend to focus on what the Americans were doing. And the Americans in the war in the Pacific, which was kind of the secondary theater, our major focus was on Europe, focused on a policy of island hopping, right? We weren't necessarily going to try and take back every single bit of territory that the Japanese took. The idea was to just try and make a path towards Japan so we could bomb Japan and eventually invade Japan if necessary, though you can see we did take a little detour to liberate the Philippines. But if you are familiar with the war in the Pacific, this tends to be the perspective that we look at. And I want us to think more about the Japanese and Chinese perspective in particular. We just, in a sense, talked a little bit about the Korean perspective. So first of all, we have to emphasize that the major show for Japan was China. Most Japanese troops were in China. In fact, the Americans, in terms of military army, we only faced 1/6 of the Japanese army the Chinese had to face 5/6, right? So the Chinese are really carrying a heavy burden in this war. We have to remember that is that the Chinese had massive armies that tied down a huge number of Japan's troops. And if it were not for the Chinese doing this, the Americans, we would have had to face a lot more soldiers. We would have lost more people. And I think this is one thing that is often forgotten is that the Chinese did fight hard. In many cases fought well. It was difficult at times because they often lacked supplies and did not have time to train enough soldiers. So sometimes the soldiers were not particularly well-trained supply, but they did fight well enough that they were able to tie down large numbers of Japanese troops. And so while the Japanese would try and launch massive offensives in 1943 and 1944 that were victorious, the success they achieved was insufficient, right? They were able to defeat Chinese armies, but they were not able to completely destroy Chinese resistance. The Chinese, particularly the nationalists, the communists are not going to participate much. They're going to do their best to stay out of the war because they know that a civil war is going to follow up. The Chinese nationalists will fight very hard, and while they will typically lose battles, they don't need to win them. They just need to tie down these Japanese troops, let Japan get tired. So while the Japanese will win these battles, they're insufficient victories. They're not decisive enough to end the war. So basically the Chinese are going to fight hard. At the same time, though, they do this with a lot of American support. The United States will send significant support to the Chinese in their fight against Japan. And one thing that I think is kind of an interesting little, I don't know, fun fact is appropriate, but when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, when Chiang Kai-shek learned of that attack, he was jubilant and actually took out a gramophone, which if you're not familiar with what a gramophone is, it's like an early record player, and listened to Ave Maria, kind of classical music in a sense. So he was he did this to celebrate. He was so happy because he knew that once the Americans were in the war against Japan, Japan could not win, right? Japan is unable to win the war in China, and it's not able to stop the American Allied advance. Right, so there's just the Japanese military has led the Japanese people into this really terrible situation, right? They promised a quick and easy war in China. That does not happen. In order to try and win that war, they attack the United States. And so they end up fighting two foes that they cannot possibly defeat. And I should point out that also they're at war with Great Britain and Australia and a bunch of other people too. So Japan is going to lose. They're just not able to stand up to this combined American Allied advance with the Chinese doing such good work, keeping Japanese soldiers busy. Let's shift over then to talk a little bit about the Japanese experience of war. It was often pretty miserable for Japanese soldiers. One thing I want to stress was even though we have a militarized government, that doesn't mean that the average Japanese soldier was treated well. Japanese soldiers were often treated very poorly. They were typically poorly supplied. The discipline was very fierce. So, for example, there was a saying, and to explain this, I need you to know that if you go into a traditional Japanese house, there's often these kind of straw mats called tatami mats. And in order to get the mats to be comfortable, you have to really kind of tenderize them. You have to beat them. You may have seen like an old movie where someone would clean a rug by like beating it outside to get the dirt out. Well, to get tatami mats to be in good shape, you had to beat them. And so there was a saying that soldiers are like tatami mats. The more you beat them, the better they are, right? So Japanese military discipline was very fierce. It was common for officers and NCOs to beat the soldiers, to literally like strike them. And there's a story I remember hearing one Japanese soldier recall how he said that, you know, sometimes the officers would get tired of beating us, so we would be ordered to beat each other. So Japanese soldiers often underwent really terrible, brutal conditions. And I think we should not be surprised in a sense that they would brutalize Chinese civilians or other people, including American POWs. Why would you treat them nicely when your own army does not treat you all that well? And one thing I think that's particularly striking about the Japanese experience of war for the Japanese soldiers was the large number of them who starved to death. Lots of Japanese soldiers were basically abandoned and told just to kind of take care of themselves and were not given supplies. And I think that's a sign of a really terrible government that it would would send these troops off to fight and then abandon them and not allow them to surrender. Japanese soldiers were not supposed to surrender. If you surrendered, your family would basically be shamed, and people would look down on them. And it was actually, in a sense, illegal for Japanese soldiers to surrender. And they were put under tremendous pressure not to surrender. It was better for them to kill themselves. And if you died in battle, your family was given like extra food rations back home. But if you were captured, they didn't get anything. But basically there was this pressure not to surrender. So you had all these Japanese soldiers who just simply starved to death because the government refused to support them and just abandoned them. And this is a sign that you should probably negotiate a way to end this war. But the Japanese military government would not allow that. They just insisted that Japanese soldiers fight even without having food to eat. One of the reasons that the Americans followed this strategy of island hopping was we hoped to get close enough to start bombing Japan in preparation for an invasion. This included conventional bombing, and Americans typically did not purposely attack civilian population centers. We always attacked areas that had some kind of military significance. It's just the problem is bombs are not all that accurate, and large numbers of civilians could die. The Japanese also would disperse their factories. So instead of having like one big factory, they would have machines scattered all throughout residential areas. So in order to hit those machines and those small little factories, we would bomb the residential areas. And eventually the Americans switched to firebombing, which are bombs that are not meant simply to explode and do damage. They don't actually cause much of an explosion at all. What they do is they carry like a jelly-like substance that burns when it comes into contact with oxygen. And what happens is these bombs hit the ground, they detonate, make a small explosion that spreads around this jelly, and it starts fires. And then it just burns down everything, especially because Japanese houses are typically made of wood and paper. And this did kill tremendous amounts of civilians. In one firebombing raid in Tokyo, it killed over 100,000 people in one night. In an effort to stop this kind of bombing and the oncoming Americans, Japanese soldiers were either volunteered or were pressured to join what are called kamikaze units. These were basically units of suicide soldiers. Their job would be to pilot typically a plane loaded with bombs into an American ship. This was actually an efficient tactic. It actually worked rather well, militarily speaking. But of course, by this time that you have to launch suicide attacks, you probably should negotiate the end of the war. While some Japanese soldiers did this because they believed in this kind of propaganda they'd been told, others just understood this as a way of hopefully stopping the Americans so they could protect their families. Right. So for many Japanese, even if you didn't agree with the propaganda, the Americans are bombing your country. You want to stop them from invading. This is what you need to do. Japan, though, is gotten to the state basically where they're running out of men. They will actually start training civilians to act as soldiers. And they are seriously planning on trying to defend the home islands with civilians, including boys and young girls, as you can kind of see here. This is a very, I think, striking image. This idea, that these young ladies are going to help defend our country against, American Marines. And of course, I mean, they can shoot a gun, they can kill. And this would have been just a huge amount of casualties that the Americans would have actually had to invade, it would seem. Boys were also being taught how they could attack tanks. They could carry explosives and try and blow up American tanks. So there was a census idea for Japanese civilians to become soldiers, right? And in a sense, to all become kamikaze in order to defend the Japan and the militarized government. However, an invasion will not happen. On August 6th, the United States will drop an atomic bomb on the city of Hiroshima. On August 8th, the Soviet Union will enter the war against Japan and very quickly smash through Manchuria and even start invading into Korea. On August 9th, the Americans will bomb Nagasaki, and Japan will then finally decide to surrender on August 15th. The Japanese emperor will support this surrender, even though the Army and Navy do not want to surrender. Even at this point, the Army and Navy want to keep fighting. But the Japanese emperor realizes that if he continues, the population will probably rebel and overthrow him. And so in this way, he can end the war while preserving his throne and preserving the imperial system. And we talked a whole lot about that. Basically, the Japanese emperor, because of the understanding of the role of the emperor and the imperial system in Japanese national identity, for the Japanese emperor, it was fine if a lot of Japanese people died in order to prepare to preserve the imperial throne, because that's what it meant to be Japanese, right? There's a fundamental difference here between how Americans saw the war. Americans wanted to end the war quickly with the least amount of casualties, which is one reason why we were willing to use atomic bombs to protect American lives. Because to Americans, the nation is the people, right? We have to, we're a government of the people, for the people, by the people. We don't want Americans to die. From the Japanese emperors and from the military government's position, this is the Japanese side, the Japanese military government and the Japanese emperor, for them, the point of the war is to preserve the imperial system in which the military is dominant and which the emperor is the center. So they don't really care if a lot of Japanese people die. It's not really a big deal for them. And I'm not kidding about this. They just did not seem to be bothered by the large amount of Japanese people that were dying. In fact, they glorified the large amount of Japanese people dying. And the Japanese emperor is able then to present himself as the liberator, as the one who saves them, because he says, this war is going terrible. The Americans are so cruel. They're using this new weapon, these atomic bombs. So to prevent the destruction of the world and of Japan, we will endure the unendurable, and that will be the end of the war. He doesn't actually use the word surrender, but he presents himself in his declaration of surrender as basically saving everything and bringing about a new opportunity for peace. But as we've seen, the emperor was just quite fine with the military as long as it was winning the war. But now he wants to try and preserve his throne. So he's going to just say, this is a terrible war, but I'm a good guy. I'm going to end it now so there won't be further suffering. But in any case, that's the end of World War II in Asia. Now, I have been very hard on Japan and the Japanese military, and I think as a historian, I'm right to be hard on them. They did lead the Japanese people into a terrible war that killed lots of people and that could have been avoided if the military would have listened to other people instead of killing them, as we saw previously. But I do want to give something as a historian. I need to give you counter evidence. I need to show you other narratives. So I just want to note what Ishiwara Kanji, remember the guy who plotted the Manchurian incident in 1931, where they blew up the railway in order to justify taking over that large part of Chinese territory. I do want to give him a chance to talk, because he does make a very good point at the end of the war. And this is Ishiwara Kanji speaking at the International Military Tribunal. This is basically a war crimes trial. And he says to the Americans who are questioning him, "Haven't you ever heard of Perry?" Remember, that's the American Commodore who forcibly opened Japan to international trade. "Don't you know anything about our country's history? Tokugawa Japan believed in isolation. It didn't want to have anything to do with other countries and had its doors locked tightly. Then along came Perry from your country and his black ships to open those doors. He aimed his big guns at Japan and warned, 'If you don't deal with us, look out for these. Open your doors and negotiate with other countries too.' And then when Japan did open its doors and try dealing with other countries, it learned that all those countries were a fearfully aggressive lot. And so for its own defense, it took your own country as its teacher and set about learning how to be aggressive. You might say we became your disciples. Why don't you subpoena Perry from the other world and try him as a war criminal?" Now, Ishiwara Kanji has a good point here, right? Japan was forcibly opened by the Americans, and Japan was open to a world in which Western imperialism was dominant, and Japanese were convinced that if they didn't become an empire, they would become a colony, right? So in fairness to Japan, we have to note that, right? I don't want this just to be anti-Japanese. I'm not anti-Japanese. However, I would point out to Ishiwara Kanji, while he does have a good point here, maybe he shouldn't have tried to seize Manchuria. Maybe that was a bad idea. And maybe predicting a coming race war and then taking actions to try and bring about a race war, maybe that was a bad idea. But in any case, while I think Ishiwara Kanji was fundamentally wrong in that it was wrong to, try and deal with Japan's problems by invading China, I do think he has a good point here if we want to understand why Japan acted the way it did. And if we also have to acknowledge that sometimes Americans can do things without realizing it that contribute to war, you could say. And we need to be better at realizing those things. So now I want to emphasize that I don't want to belittle American suffering in World War II, but I just want to highlight how this war was really catastrophic in East Asia, right? So to give you a highlight, right? In the U.S., we lost about 400,000 people. That's about 0.3% of our population at the time. China lost 10 to 20 million people, about 4%, 2 to 4% of its population. Japan lost 2.5 to 3 million, much less than China, but wow, that was 4.5% of its population. Korea lost between 350 and 500,000, not nearly as many as China, but remember, Korea is a lot smaller. That's 1.5 to 2% of the population. So this war was really devastating, right? In Japan and China, basically you had a 1 in 25 chance of dying in this war. So very, very serious. And I included an image here. I think this is a way to kind of help us think about this as an East Asian catastrophe. The woman they're bowing is a Japanese citizen, but she was adopted by Chinese people during World War II, and she's remembering her adopted parents. And it's interesting. The up there, that circle is talking about the love of peace and friendship, right? That's something we need to have peace, is this kind of friendship. So hopefully that's something this class will contribute to, or at least we can understand how peace breaks down and how war breaks out. And hopefully you can prevent these kinds of terrible suffering. And once again, China has bet on the right side, right? Remember, in World War I, Japan and China were both on the Allied side. Japan in the Second World War picked the wrong side and ended up on the losers. China ended up on the right side. And it seems that at the end of World War II, Chiang Kai-shek and the Nationalist Party should be doing really well in China, right? They have some big advantages. The unequal treaties are gone now, right? They last till 1943, but Chiang Kai-shek is able to insist, hey, we're allies now. We're fighting together. How can you have these unequal treaties going back like a century that treat China as this weak country that it cannot be taken seriously? We are making a major contribution to the war effort. You need to recognize that. And so the unequal treaties that it has will be gotten rid of, will be abolished. Chiang Kai-shek will restore control over Manchuria, right? Remember that very valuable area? Now Chiang Kai-shek gets it back. And Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union, will recognize the nationalists as the rightful leaders of China and promises not to help the communists. He'll break the promise, but he does recognize the nationalists. And Chiang Kai-shek and China will receive a seat on the UN Security Council, right? The United Nations will be established. Chiang Kai-shek will have an army that's twice as big as the Communist Army, actually bigger earlier on, more advanced weapons, and a navy and an air force. Yet, Chiang Kai-shek will lose to the communists, right? One thing we have to understand is that the Chinese Civil War doesn't really end. It becomes kind of a Cold War with a little bit of fighting, but the nationalists and communists are still both there. They want, each one wants to have power. And so once the war ends, fighting will break out again between the Chinese communists and the Chinese nationalists. So the poor Chinese, goodness gracious, World War II ending is not a break for them. It's just a prelude to another war. And like I said, what's really striking about this war is despite all these advantages I just talked about, the nationalists are going to lose the war, right? The nationalists are going to lose the war despite all these advantages. Why? Why do they lose the war? And a way to kind of rephrase this question to help us, I think, understand it a little bit better is, why do the nationalists lose and the communists win? Well, first of all, the nationalists are weaker after the war than they were before the war. Remember, Chiang Kai-shek will lose a lot of his best troops in the war. So his position actually gets weaker. He's the one that will have to do most of the fighting. So he will constantly be raising armies, constantly having them defeated, constantly losing his best soldiers. So he's going to be weaker after the war than before, militarily speaking. His army might be bigger, but that doesn't mean they're better. He's lost, like I said, a lot of his best troops. In comparison, the communists stay out of the war. They do comparatively little fighting, right? The communists are not the major group. The nationalists have to fight because they're the recognized government of China. They're expected to fight. The communists, they're just an insurgent group. No one really expects them to fight that much. So they spend their time building up to try and become stronger and will not risk any major battles really with the Japanese. They do fight one fairly large battle with the Japanese and they lose, and then after that they don't want to fight any more big battles. They mostly fight guerrilla war and do their best to build up their strength and not to spend it fighting the Japanese. The nationalists are also cut off from their support, right? Remember, the major nationalist support came from either landlords or from the urban middle classes, especially business people. But remember, the nationalists lose most of the big cities during the war. They get them back, but they're cut off from that support. In contrast, while the nationalists are cut off from their support, weakening them, the communists, remember, under Mao Zedong, who wanted to emphasize the peasants and their power, they're able to increase their support out in the countryside while waging a guerrilla warfare. Right, so the communists are able to build up their strength in the countryside. That's where they're hiding out from the Japanese. The Japanese focus on the cities. That weakens the nationalists because their strength is in the cities, but it doesn't really hurt the communists. In fact, the communists can benefit from it. China, during this time period, has a huge number of economic problems. After World War II, even during the war, they had lots of economic problems. Those will continue. They won't really be able to get them under control. There'll be problems like inflation, unemployment. It'll be difficult to rebuild. And also one problem is because of those economic issues, there will be massive corruption. The Nationalist Party becomes incredibly corrupt. Right? Money that should be going to support soldiers is routinely going into the pockets of the officers, for example. So there's this big problem in that there's massive economic problems in China, leading to a lot of corruption. And of course, everyone blames the nationalists because, hey, they're in charge. And a lot of times the corrupt officials are nationalist officials. In contrast, the communists promised to bring change. Right? They promised to bring change. He said, we're going to fix all these issues. These nationalists are not able to do it. They've had years to fix these issues, and they're not able to do it, but we communists can. The nationalists, during the war and even after the war, tended to treat their soldiers pretty poorly. They didn't necessarily mean to do this, but they didn't have a lot of supplies, so soldiers were often poorly fed. So soldiers then would often steal from civilians, right? You're a soldier, you don't have any food, but you got a gun, so you just go over to civilians and you take their food. And that happened quite a bit with the nationalists, right? So nationalist army, because it didn't have many supplies, in a large part because of this problem of corruption, often treated its soldiers poorly, but they still have guns, so they'll just go take the food from the civilians. So the civilians really hate, a lot of times, the nationalists. In contrast, the communists will bring land reform. They'll take land reform from very pro-Japanese Chinese or from very rich landlords and give it to the peasants. Don't worry, later they'll take it away, but they'll give it to the peasants, and that gets them support. And the Chinese communists are very well disciplined. The Chinese communists will not steal food generally. They will pay for what they take, and they're famous for doing things like when they would come into a village, instead of insisting that they stay inside the villagers' houses and kind of take over their homes, they would actually sleep out in the road, sleep out in the street. So the communists become popular in a large part, and this is strategic, through land reform, right? We'll talk more about that later, and because they will treat people relatively well, especially compared to the nationalists. And among the nationalists, all these problems lead to a loss of faith in their cause. It's not quite clear what the nationalists are trying to do. Their vision for New China doesn't seem like it's going to ever actually happen, right? So it's hard for anyone to really be excited about the nationalists, to think that they're going to have any kind of major change or reform that will help China. So there's a loss of faith in the nationalist cause. They don't know what they're doing. They don't have a clear vision. In contrast, the communists, they haven't had the opportunity to really try out their ideas on a nationwide scale, but their policies are winning the support of a lot of people. They're going to make lots of promises, tell people they're going to bring a new world. They're acting better than the nationalists. So this leads many people to believe in them. And the communists themselves will deeply believe that through communism, they can bring about and establish a strong China and a more equitable China, a China of equality, right? Where the peasants will be treated well, where workers will be treated well. So they have a vision. And because they're behaving better, people are more likely to believe that their vision will actually become reality. So the Chinese Civil War will be won by the communists in a sense for those reasons I outlined. I'm going to go into a little bit more detail here to talk about how the Civil War is actually fought. But this lasts from 1945 to 1949, right? After the Japanese surrender, the Americans will attempt to mediate. We're hoping that some kind of compromise can be worked out between the nationalists and communists. That fails, and war breaks out. The nationalists attempt to seize as much territory as possible, and in particular, they want to seize control of Manchuria because, hey, that's a really wealthy part of China. We've already established that, right? Earlier, that's a very wealthy part of China. It actually had not suffered much damage during the war, and was going to be able to get up and rolling pretty quickly. So the nationalists wanted to get as much territory as possible that they lost back. They don't want to go under communist control. The problem is that the Soviet Union will support the Chinese communists in Manchuria, and that will serve as a base for those communists. And what happens then is the nationalists will spread their forces too thin. Remember, the Soviet Union had invaded Manchuria when it attacked Japan, so they're able then to support those communists in Manchuria. The nationalist forces are spread too thin, so the communists will just take over the countryside. The nationalists will be stuck in the cities. So the nationalists are spread all over the place in China, so they're only able to hold the cities in Manchuria. The communists will focus their strength in Manchuria, where they have communist Soviet support. They'll be in the countryside, and they will surround those nationalist troops. And the nationalist troops will be isolated from each other. They're not able to support each other. They're cut off from each other, and they're cut off from supplies. So you've got these, Chiang Kai-shek is trying to control like everything. He spreads his troops too thin. So the communists, even though they don't have as big of an army, they're able to focus on the nationalist forces in Manchuria, besiege them, and they're all isolated. They can't help each other, and they can't be resupplied. So what will happen then is that the nationalist armies will surrender, right? They're cut off from supplies. They're cut off from military reinforcements, and the communists then will seize their weapons. And communist policy was to be merciful towards the nationalist soldiers who surrendered. And so what happened was a lot of times the nationalist soldiers would just become communist soldiers, right? And I include this picture on purpose. Those are communist soldiers. That's an American tank, right? We gave the nationalists a tank, but then the communists just captured it. And the communists joke that the Americans were their best supplier of weapons, right? Because we would give stuff to the nationalists would get defeated, and then the communist soldiers would take it. And this allowed then the communist army to transform from a guerrilla army to a conventional army that would fight the nationalists head to head, and that army would go on to defeat the nationalists. The nationalists would then flee to Taiwan, and thanks, in a sense, to American naval support, would be able to survive there and establish the Republic of China. And our course will look more at the Republic of China later. But for now, I want to stress, in this way, despite all this support, the communists were able to defeat the nationalists, and in 1949, they become the masters of China. They're now in charge of China. They're the government.